This is the Fantasy Football Podcast, where we take data and convert it into fantasy success. No bias, no hot takes, only victory. This is the Fantasy Alchemist Podcast, and now your host, Dustin Chandry. Welcome into the Fantasy Alchemist Podcast. I'm your host, Dustin Chandry, recording Thursday evening, September 14th. And this episode will be a special research-based podcast. I'll aim to do a data dive into a topic or theme throughout the season, and then especially through the offseason. But for the first, what I'm calling a fantasy forensic, I'm going to start with a simple concept. You see, I think most of us had a really miserable first week of the 2023 season because so many top players and teams underperformed from a fantasy standpoint. Now, I've heard it bandied about that scoring was down, but was that true? How true was it? If it was true, why did it happen? Should we be concerned about week 2? Right? These are all reasonable questions I think we should be asking ourselves following a week like we had in week 1, where so many things just didn't go the way we anticipated. Now, before we get started, make sure to follow us on Twitter at FFAlchemistPod, now blue check verified. We'll post the data and visualizations described in today's episode on our account. Again, it's at FFAlchemistPod. And now for today's Fantasy Forensic. So I started my analysis with the quarterback position because, while so much focus is on the quarterback, both in importance because as many quarterbacks perform, so typically does the rest of the supporting skill positions, but also week 1 saw so many bad quarterback performances. And what made things worse is that many of the top 12, top 10 quarterbacks who are in our starting lineups, they performed terribly, right? Joe Burrow, Josh Allen, Lamar Jackson, Dak Prescott, Daniel Jones, right? They all underperformed. And the ones who actually did produce points were outside the top 12 and probably not in our starting lineups. Anthony Richardson, Tua, Mac Jones, Jordan Love. So the first thing I did was I simply charted total fantasy points scored by all quarterbacks. I looked at every single week for the last 2 years plus what happened in week 1 of 2023. Now, week 1 barely broke 450 combined fantasy points for all quarterbacks in the league. Now, over the last 2 years, there have only been 5 weeks that went below 450 combined points. However, that doesn't even adjust for bye weeks where, right, you can have a number of teams that are out, right? We could have somewhere between 2 to 6 teams on bye. Week 1 saw all 32 teams playing. In fact, the only other week where the total number of fantasy points scored by all quarterbacks was lower than week 1, where every single team played, was week 18 of last year, right? That's the end of the regular season where you had many instances of bad weather, backups, and teams with really nothing to play for. So then what I did is I compared week 1 of 2023 against the week 1 performance across the league with all quarterbacks for the last 2 years, week 1 of 2021 and week 1 of 2022. And what I saw, well, quite frankly, it alarmed me, right? So if we just looked at total fantasy points scored by all quarterbacks for week 1 the last 3 years, 2021, 642 points scored. 2022, 564. 2023, 441. That's a 31% decline from that 2021 high, right? Quarterback scoring was down almost a third compared to 2 years ago. So then I asked myself, is it opportunity or is it performance or some sort of combination of the two? So I first looked at opportunities. Snaps have gradually declined. It was down about 6% over that 2-year sample. And then passing attempts have also dropped about 9%. So there is some decline in opportunity for the quarterbacks. However, the decline in performance across the league was far more concerning. Completion percentage, it was down slightly, but then you had passing yards were down 26%, air yards were down 17%, and most shockingly, total touchdowns, which would be passing plus rushing, total touchdowns were down 39%. Right? In week 1 of 2021, all quarterbacks combined for 66 touchdowns. 2022, it was down to 55, and last week in 2023, it was down to 40. We went from 60 to 55 to 40. So across the league in week one, quarterbacks saw fewer opportunities than previous years, but their performance decline was much worse, especially in the touchdown department. In fact, there was only 1 week in the past 2 years where every team played that had fewer touchdowns for the quarterback position than week one. Now, when I looked at other positions, things were just as bad for the wide receiver and the tight end position group. And that makes sense, right? If a quarterback is struggling, the wide receivers and the tight ends are naturally going to suffer with them from a fantasy standpoint because those positions are directly contingent on the quarterback as opposed to a running back who you can at least just hand the ball off to. Now, for wide receivers, I limited the analysis to the top 40 wide receivers for each week one of the last 3 years, since I think this would typically represent your consideration set for lineups and rosters. Now, total fantasy points for wide receivers, it's down 14% from 2 years ago. It was at 813 in 2021, down to 726 in 2022, and is now at 696 in week one of this year. But while total fantasy points was down 14%, targets and receptions, they looked pretty similar. There wasn't much of a decline. And the main reason for the decline in total fantasy points then was because of two things. One, receiving yardage, which was down 13%. And then as we touched with the quarterback position, receiving touchdowns was down dramatically, down 34%. Compared to 2 years ago, when total receiving touchdowns of the top 40 was 38 receiving touchdowns. 2022, it was 28. And then last week for the start of 2023, it was down to 25 touchdowns. Now, it's also worth noting that because total snaps were down slightly and the percent of pass plays were down slightly, the reason the top wide receivers got pretty similar target and reception volume, and it appeared to be stable over the last 3 years, is because of an increase in target share and an increase in targets per route run. But even the top wide receivers still did not get the yardage or the touchdowns like we've seen in previous years. As for the tight end group, this group was the hardest hit in the analysis. Without Travis Kelce and Mark Andrews in the 2023 set for week one, the position suffered greatly. Now, I limited my analysis to only the top 20 tight ends for each week of the last 3 week ones, but total fantasy points was down 36% compared to 2 years ago. Fantasy points in 2021, week one was 286. In 2022, it was 235. And then last week, for the first week of 2023, it was at 183, right? We went 286, 235, 183. But on top of the total fantasy points being down for the group, targets and receptions were also both down significantly. Receiving yards and touchdowns were down even worse. So compared to 2 years ago for the tight end position, targets were down 14%, receptions were down 20%, receiving yards were down 37%, and receiving touchdowns was down a whopping 54%. Right, 2 years ago, first week of 2021, 13 total touchdowns for the top 20 tight ends. Last year, it was 9. This year, down to 6. And even though the tight end group is running roughly the same amount of routes as they have been in previous season, their target share and their targets per route run are dropping, and they are being funneled towards wide receivers and running backs. And I think this is further evidence that if you don't have an elite tight end like Kelce or Andrews, you're probably just better off waiting until the end of your draft to select one. Or you can just take a waiver wire dart throw every single week. Because last week, TJ Hawkinson and Evan Ingram were the only guys drafted in the top 10 of their position who actually finished in the top 10 in week one. There's just a lot of volatility at the position. Now, as for the running back group, this group had the smallest variance compared to the previous 2 years. You see, fantasy points for this group was actually down only 6%. This was the lowest of the 4 position groups. All the other positions were down at least double digits from 2021. And most importantly, the touchdown volume, rushing plus receiving, has remained similar over the last 2 years. The only real decline I'm seeing is coming in rushing yards, which was down 11% for the running back group. Okay, so what does this all mean? What do we actually do with this? Truthfully, I did this exercise mainly for myself because I was worried that I had made some terrible mistakes in my preseason estimates. But honestly, it truly just looks like a bad week with a lot of exceptions that are well outside the historical norm. For example, I started charting quarterbacks who had bad weeks in week one, looking at their fantasy points and putting that next to their expected points above average per play. And many of the quarterbacks I looked at were well outside their weekly median performance, indicating that these are extreme outlier performances. There's nothing here to indicate what we saw in week one is something we should continue to see going forward this season. Of course, touchdown volume, which can be very sticky week to week, it is primed for some serious positive regression across the league. I will mention I posted a few quarterback examples of this, including Joe Burrow, Daniel Jones, Lamar Jackson. I posted those on our Twitter page so you can go see for yourself. I expect bounce back games for all of the top 12 quarterbacks who struggled early as we progress throughout the season. Again, you can find that material on our Twitter page at FFAlchemistPod. And make sure to hit subscribe, leave a review, and we will return early next week with a recap of week 2. This is Dustin Chandry signing off for the Fantasy Alchemist Podcast, Special Fantasy Forensic. Thank you for listening.
Thank you for listening to the Fantasy Alchemist Podcast. You can follow the pod on Twitter at FFAlchemistPod or email us at fantasyalchemistpodcast@gmail.com.